The power went out at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I watched through my binoculars as Margaret Thornfield stood in her driveway, frantically pressing buttons on her garage door remote. Her face was turning that familiar shade of red I'd grown to know so well over the past 18 months. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had just flipped a switch that would change everything. You see, Margaret had been waging war against my 40-foot wind turbine for over a year, slapping me with fine after fine, threatening lawsuits, and making my life hell. She thought she had all the power in our little corner of Millbrook Estates. But as I watched her designer heels click helplessly across her now powerless driveway, I couldn't help but smile. Because Margaret Thornfield, HOA president and self-appointed queen of our neighborhood, had just learned the hard way that I didn't just own a wind turbine. I owned the entire electrical grid that powered her precious gated community. But let me back up 6 months to where this all started. I'd just inherited my grandfather's 47-acre ranch on the outskirts of Millbrook Estates, a sprawling property that had been in my family for 3 generations. The land was beautiful, rolling hills dotted with oak trees, and right in the center sat the old farmhouse where I'd spent every summer of my childhood. What I didn't expect was the culture shock. See, when Grandpa Joe bought this land in 1962, it was all rural farmland stretching to the horizon. But sometime in the 1990s, Pinnacle Development Corporation had swooped in and built Millbrook Estates, a luxury gated community for Austin's tech elite right up against our property line. These weren't just houses, they were monuments to excess. 6,000 square foot McMansions with perfectly manicured lawns, each one costing more than most people make in a decade. And they all had one thing in common. They despised my grandfather's working ranch. The complaints started immediately after I moved in. My rooster was too loud. My cattle were an eyesore. The smell from the barn was affecting property values. But I ignored them, just like Grandpa Joe had for 30 years. This was my land, and I had every right to farm it. That's when I decided to honor my grandfather's memory by installing something he'd always dreamed of, a wind turbine. Now, this wasn't some dinky residential unit. This was a serious piece of equipment, a 40-foot tower with 12-foot blades that could generate enough clean energy to power my entire ranch and then some. I'd done my research, pulled all the proper permits from the county, and even had it professionally installed by Lone Star Wind Solutions. The day they erected that turbine, I felt like I was carrying on Grandpa Joe's legacy of self-sufficiency and environmental stewardship. I should have known Margaret wouldn't let it slide. Margaret Thornfield was what you'd get if you crossed a suburban soccer mom with a corporate lawyer and added a healthy dose of entitlement. She lived in the largest house in Millbrook Estates, a gaudy 8,000 square foot monstrosity with more columns than the Parthenon. Her husband, Richard, was some kind of investment banker who traveled constantly, leaving Margaret to rule their domestic kingdom with an iron fist. She'd been HOA president for 8 years running, and she treated the position like she was governing a small nation. 3 days after my turbine went live, Margaret came marching up my gravel driveway in her designer suit and pearl necklace, looking like she was headed to a board meeting rather than a cattle ranch. She was clutching a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. "Mr. Rodriguez," she announced, not bothering with pleasantries, "I am here regarding your unauthorized industrial installation." "Ma'am, with all due respect," I replied, leaning against my porch railing, "I'm not part of your HOA. This is private property, and I have all the county permits." Her perfectly painted lips curled into what she probably thought was a smile. "Actually, Mr. Rodriguez, you are mistaken." She opened that folder and pulled out a stack of documents that would make a Supreme Court justice dizzy. Deed restrictions, easement agreements, municipal codes. She'd done her homework. According to Margaret's interpretation of a 1994 agreement between my grandfather and Pinnacle Development, any industrial or commercial structures visible from Millbrook Estates were subject to HOA approval. Your wind turbine violates Section 7.3 of our architectural guidelines, she continued, reading from what looked like a legal brief. Industrial structures must be screened from view and cannot exceed 20 feet in height. I stared at her, then at the papers, then back at her. This is a working ranch, Mrs. Thornfield. That agreement was about agricultural operations, not renewable energy. Wind turbines are industrial equipment, Mr. Rodriguez. The fine is $500 per day until you remove it or bring it into compliance. And just like that, she turned on her designer heel and walked away, leaving me holding papers that might as well have been written in ancient Sanskrit. I spent that night poring over every document, calling my lawyer, and researching property law until my eyes burned. What I discovered made my blood boil. The 1994 agreement was a sweetheart deal that Pinnacle Development had pressured my grandfather into signing when he was 78 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia. They'd basically strong-armed him into giving them visual veto power over his own land. But here's what Margaret didn't know. I wasn't some naive rancher who'd roll over and play dead. I was a licensed electrical engineer who'd spent 15 years working for Austin Energy before inheriting the ranch. And during those 15 years, I'd specialized in power grid infrastructure and renewable energy integration. I knew every wire, transformer, and switching station within a 50-mile radius. More importantly, I knew something about Millbrook Estates that even Margaret didn't fully understand. The first fine arrived by certified mail exactly 1 week later. $500 for continued violation of architectural standards. The letter was printed on heavy cardstock with the HOA's official seal, like Margaret was running the Pentagon instead of a suburban neighborhood watch. I paid it, but I also started making some phone calls. My first call was to my old colleague, Danny Kim at Austin Energy. Danny, I need you to pull the utility records for Millbrook Estates. All of them electrical, gas, water, the works. What are you up to, Miguel? Let's just say I'm doing some research on sustainable energy solutions for rural communities. The records Danny sent me were fascinating reading. Millbrook Estates was a power-hungry beast, 247 houses, averaging 6,000 square feet each, with heated pools, security systems, and central air running year-round. Their peak summer usage was astronomical, and their electrical bill would make most small businesses weep. But here's the interesting part. Millbrook Estates wasn't connected to the main Austin energy grid. When Pinnacle Development built the community in the 1990s, they'd installed their own private electrical system to maintain that exclusive feeling. They had their own transformer station, their own distribution lines, and their own maintenance contracts. It was like their own little electrical kingdom, completely separate from the municipal grid. And according to the utility records, their primary power source was a natural gas generation facility located exactly 3.2 miles southeast of their main gate. 3.2 miles southeast put it right in the middle of what used to be the old Morrison Ranch land that had been sold to Austin Energy in 2003 for infrastructure development. Land that was now leased to private operators for renewable energy projects. Land that included a 50-acre wind farm managed by Rodriguez Sustainable Solutions, LLC. The LLC I'd formed 3 years earlier when I started my renewable energy consulting business. The wind farm that generated 60% of Millbrook Estates' electrical power. I owned their lights. The second fine arrived like clockwork, another $500 for my ongoing defiance of community standards. This time, Margaret included a formal notice that the HOA was prepared to pursue all legal remedies if I didn't comply within 30 days. I decided it was time to pay Margaret a visit. Millbrook Estates' HOA office was located in what they called the community center, a building that looked more like a country club than a neighborhood meeting hall. Inside, Margaret had set up her command center, a mahogany desk the size of a small aircraft carrier, filing cabinets that could store the Library of Congress, and enough legal books to supply a law school. She looked up from her computer when I walked in, and I could see her mentally calculating how to get me arrested for trespassing. "Mr. Rodriguez, I assume you're here to discuss compliance with our architectural standards." "Actually, Mrs. Thornfield, I'm here to discuss a business proposition." I sat down across from her desk without being invited. Margaret's eyebrows shot up like I just declared war. "I'm not interested in any deals, Mr. Rodriguez. You have exactly 23 days to remove that eyesore or face escalating legal action." What if I told you I could reduce Millbrook Estates' electrical costs by 40%? That stopped her cold. Margaret might have been a control freak, but she wasn't stupid. HOA fees were always a contentious issue, and anything that could reduce operational costs would make her look good to the residents. "I'm listening," she said, leaning back in her leather chair. I pulled out my tablet and showed her the power usage data I'd compiled. "Your community uses an average of 2.3 megawatts during peak hours. Your current contract with Pinnacle Energy Solutions charges you 12 cents per kilowatt hour. I can provide clean, renewable wind power for 70 cents per kilowatt hour." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "And in exchange? You drop the fines and leave my turbine alone. It's a win-win situation." She stared at the numbers for a long moment, and I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. Finally, she looked up with that predatory smile I was learning to hate. "Mr. Rodriguez, even if your numbers are accurate, I wouldn't do business with someone who flagrantly violates our community standards. Remove the turbine, and then we can discuss your proposal." I stood up slowly, making sure to maintain eye contact. "That's unfortunate, Mrs. Thornfield. I was hoping we could work together." As I walked toward the door, I turned back with what I hoped looked like an afterthought. "Oh, by the way, you might want to double-check your power supply contracts. I noticed some irregularities in your electrical distribution system that could cause problems down the road." Her face went pale, but she recovered quickly. "Are you threatening our infrastructure, Mr. Rodriguez?" "Not at all, ma'am. Just offering some friendly advice from one neighbor to another." I left her sitting there, staring at her computer screen like it might contain the secrets of the universe. 3 days later, the third fine arrived. This time, it was $750, with a note that penalties would continue escalating until I complied. Margaret had also attached a formal legal notice threatening to place a lien on my property if the fines exceeded $5,000. She wanted to play hardball. Time to show her what hardball looked like. My next stop was the Millbrook Estates security gate, where I had a pleasant conversation with Jerry Martinez, the weekend security guard. Jerry was about my age, a veteran who'd taken the job for the steady hours and decent benefits. We talked about trucks, football, and the challenges of working for demanding bosses. "Man, Mrs. Thornfield came through here yesterday, looking like someone had stolen her car," Jerry told me as we shared a cup of coffee. "She was on the phone yelling at someone about power contracts and legal action. Sounded like business troubles." "That's rough," I sympathized. "I hope it doesn't affect the community services. Would be a shame if folks lost power or something during this heat wave we're having." Jerry nodded. "Tell me about it. These houses suck up electricity like vacuum cleaners. Mrs. Thornfield's place alone probably uses more power than my entire neighborhood." I filed that information away for later use. That evening, I called an emergency meeting of Rodriguez Sustainable Solutions Board of Directors, which consisted of me, myself, and I. We voted unanimously to review all current power supply contracts for compliance with environmental regulations and community standards. It was amazing what I discovered when I really dug into the paperwork. Millbrook Estates' power supply agreement with my wind farm was actually a three-party contract. Pinnacle Energy Solutions acted as the middleman, buying power from my wind farm at wholesale rates and reselling it to the HOA at retail prices. They were making a tidy profit skimming off the top, but that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was the contract language. According to Section 12.7 of the agreement, Rodriguez Sustainable Solutions retained the right to terminate power delivery with 48 hours notice in cases of contract violations, safety concerns, or irreconcilable disputes with end-user communities. Section 12.7 had been my lawyer's idea when we'd negotiated the original contract. She'd insisted on including language that would protect us from hostile communities that might try to cause problems for our wind farm operations. At the time, I'd thought it was overkill. Now it looked like the key to my salvation. I spent the next week documenting everything. Every fine, every threatening letter, every interaction with Margaret Thornfield. I photographed my wind turbine from every angle, showing how it was barely visible from most of the HOA properties. I compiled data proving that my turbine was actually helping stabilize the local electrical grid. Most importantly, I researched Margaret herself. What I found was fascinating. Margaret Thornfield wasn't just some bored housewife with too much time on her hands. She was a former corporate attorney who'd made her fortune in hostile takeover battles before marrying Richard and retiring to play queen of the suburbs. She was used to intimidating people into submission through legal pressure and financial threats. She'd probably never met someone who could fight back on her own terms. The fourth fine was $1,000, bringing my total to $2,750 in penalties for the crime of generating clean energy on my own land. This time, Margaret included a formal demand for a compliance hearing where I would be required to present evidence of good faith efforts to resolve this matter. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 p.m. in the Community Center conference room. I marked my calendar and started preparing my presentation. But first, I had one more phone call to make. Danny, it's Miguel. I need to ask you a hypothetical question about power grid management. Shoot. If a renewable energy provider needed to shut down their wind farm for emergency maintenance, what would be the proper notification procedure? For grid-tied systems, 48 hours minimum notice to all affected parties. Why? Just covering my bases. One more question. Do you know anyone at Channel 8 who covers environmental stories? Tuesday evening arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that makes Texas summers legendary. The community center conference room was packed with about 30 Millbrook Estates residents, all there to watch Margaret Thornfield deliver what she probably thought would be my public execution. Margaret had set up the room like a courtroom, with a long table at the front, where she sat flanked by two other HOA board members. I recognized them from the community directory: Bill Henderson, a retired banker who looked like he'd never disagreed with anyone in his life, and Susan Walsh, a real estate agent who'd probably sold half the houses in the development. I took my seat at the defendant's table, a folding chair facing the tribunal. Mr. Rodriguez, Margaret began, reading from a prepared statement, "You are here tonight because you have repeatedly violated Section 7.3 of our architectural guidelines. Despite multiple warnings and escalating fines, you continue to operate an industrial wind turbine that creates noise pollution, visual blight, and potential safety hazards for our community." She gestured to a poster board covered with photographs of my turbine taken from various angles around the neighborhood. Someone had clearly spent a lot of time documenting every possible view of my property. Furthermore, Margaret continued, "Your defiance of our legitimate authority threatens the very foundation of property values and community standards that make Millbrook Estates a desirable place to live." A few residents nodded approvingly. I recognized most of them as Margaret's usual supporters, the kind of people who measured their lawn grass with rulers and called the city if their neighbor's mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. Mr. Rodriguez, do you have anything to say in your defense? I stood up slowly, carrying my own poster board and a laptop bag. Thank you, Mrs. Thornfield. I do indeed have a few things to share. I set up my easel and pulled the cover off my presentation. It was a detailed aerial photograph of Millbrook Estates and the surrounding area, with colored lines showing the electrical distribution system. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to start by saying that I respect your concern for community standards. Property values are important, and I understand why you might be worried about industrial equipment in a residential area. A few heads nodded. Margaret looked suspicious, but let me continue. However, I think there's been some confusion about exactly what kind of equipment we're discussing and how it fits into the bigger picture of our local infrastructure. I pointed to the red lines on my map, showing the electrical grid. This is how your community receives power. These lines connect to the Pinnacle Energy Substation, which draws electricity from 3 primary sources: a natural gas facility, solar arrays, and wind generation. I clicked to my next slide, showing power usage data over the past year. Your community consumes an average of 2.3 megawatts during peak hours, with summer usage reaching as high as 3.1 megawatts during heat waves like we're experiencing right now. Margaret was frowning now, clearly not liking where this was headed. Mr. Rodriguez, we're not here to discuss. Please bear with me, Mrs. Thornfield. This is relevant to the architectural compliance issue. I clicked to the next slide, a photograph of my wind turbine with technical specifications. My turbine generates an average of 50 kilowatts during optimal wind conditions. That's enough to power approximately 35 homes, or about 14% of your community's baseload requirements. A few residents were starting to look interested. Bill Henderson was actually taking notes. Now, here's where things get interesting, I continued, clicking to a slide showing the wind farm ownership structure. The wind farm that provides 60% of Millbrook Estates' electrical power is owned and operated by Rodriguez Sustainable Solutions, LLC. I paused for effect. That's my company. The room went dead silent. Margaret's face had turned an interesting shade of purple. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the wind turbine you're asking me to remove is part of the same renewable energy network that keeps your lights on, your air conditioners running, and your property values high by providing clean, reliable, affordable electricity. Someone in the back row started whispering. Margaret banged her gavel, an actual gavel, because of course she had one. Mr. Rodriguez, even if what you're claiming is true, it doesn't change the fact that your turbine violates our architectural standards. I smiled and clicked to my final slide, the contract termination clause. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Thornfield. Which brings me to my main point. As the owner of Rodriguez Sustainable Solutions, I have the contractual right to terminate power delivery to Millbrook Estates with 48 hours written notice in cases of irreconcilable disputes with the end-user community. The whispering got louder. I heard someone say, "What does that mean?" And someone else answer, "It means he can turn off our power." Margaret's voice was shaking now. "Are you threatening to cut off our electricity, Mr. Rodriguez?" "Not at all, ma'am. I'm simply explaining the legal framework that governs our business relationship. I believe in transparency, just like you do." I packed up my laptop and folded my easel. "I'll give everyone here 48 hours to consider whether you want to continue this architectural compliance dispute or whether you'd prefer to find a more collaborative solution." As I walked toward the door, I turned back to face the room. Oh, and just so everyone knows, the Channel 8 environmental reporter will be here Thursday morning to do a feature story on renewable energy conflicts in rural communities. Should be interesting viewing. I left them sitting there in stunned silence, except for Margaret, who was frantically shuffling through papers like she could find some magical legal loophole. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 6 a.m. The first call was from Bill Henderson. "Miguel, is it true you can shut off our power?" "Legally, yes. But I don't want to do that, Bill. I want to find a solution that works for everyone. What would it take to make this whole thing go away? Drop the fines and leave my turbine alone. It's that simple." The second call was from Susan Walsh. "Mr. Rodriguez, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. Could we schedule a time to discuss this situation more diplomatically?" By 10 a.m., I'd received calls from 8 different residents, all expressing concern about their electrical service and interest in resolving the dispute amicably. Margaret called at 11:30. "Mr. Rodriguez, I want to clarify that the HOA has never had any intention of interfering with essential utility services." "I appreciate that, Mrs. Thornfield. Does that mean you're withdrawing the architectural compliance fines?" There was a long pause. "We're prepared to discuss a modified enforcement approach." "That's not really an answer, ma'am." Another pause. "The fines are suspended pending further review." "And the turbine?" "The turbine may be grandfathered under existing agricultural use provisions." I almost laughed. 24 hours earlier, she'd been threatening to put a line on my property. Now my turbine was suddenly protected under agricultural use provisions that didn't exist. "That sounds reasonable, Mrs. Thornfield. I appreciate your flexibility." "Mr. Rodriguez, about that reporter. Channel 8? Don't worry about them. I'm sure they'll find plenty to talk about regarding renewable energy cooperation between rural and suburban communities." I hung up and walked out to check on my cattle. The turbine was spinning lazily in the morning breeze, its blades catching the sunlight like a giant pinwheel. It was beautiful, functional, and completely legal. Most importantly, it was staying right where it was. But Margaret Thornfield wasn't done with me yet. The next few days were blissfully quiet. My phone stopped ringing, no new fines appeared in my mailbox, and I actually had time to focus on running my ranch. I was starting to think Margaret had learned her lesson and would leave me alone. I should have known better. The ambush came on Friday afternoon while I was fixing fence posts in my south pasture. A black Lincoln Navigator came bouncing up my gravel road like it was on a mission from God. Margaret was driving, but she wasn't alone. The passenger seat held a man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They parked next to my barn and climbed out, Margaret in her usual battle armor of designer clothes and righteous indignation, her companion looking around my ranch like he was visiting a foreign country. "Mr. Rodriguez," Margaret announced, "I'd like you to meet Richard Blackwood, senior partner at Blackwood and Associates. They specialize in property law." The lawyer extended his hand with the enthusiasm of a man attending his own funeral. "Mr. Rodriguez, Mrs. Thornfield has retained my firm to explore legal options regarding your wind turbine installation." I shook his hand and gestured toward my porch. "Gentlemen, ma'am, would you like some iced tea? It's hotter than a branding iron out here." Richard looked interested, but Margaret cut him off. "This is a business meeting, Mr. Rodriguez. We're here to present you with a final settlement offer." She pulled out yet another manila folder, this one even thicker than the last. "We've done extensive research into the 1994 property agreement between your grandfather and Pinnacle Development. Our interpretation is that your wind turbine clearly violates the spirit, if not the letter, of those restrictions." Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Thornfield, as I explained earlier, the legal precedent on this matter is somewhat—" "The legal precedent is clear," Margaret interrupted. "Industrial installations require HOA approval regardless of property boundaries when they impact community aesthetics." I took off my work gloves and sat down on my porch steps. What exactly are you proposing? We're prepared to drop all existing fines and waive future architectural compliance issues if you agree to relocate your wind turbine to a location that's not visible from Millbrook Estates. And where might that be? Margaret smiled like she'd just solved world hunger. The north corner of your property, behind the tree line. It's only about 400 yards from your current location. I looked toward the north corner, where a stand of oak trees blocked the view toward the highway. It was also where the wind patterns were completely wrong for power generation, where the soil was too soft for a stable foundation, and where the elevation was too low for optimal turbine placement. Mrs. Thornfield, moving the turbine to that location would reduce its efficiency by about 60%. It wouldn't generate enough power to run my barn, much less contribute to the grid. That's not our problem, Mr. Rodriguez. Richard was looking more uncomfortable by the minute. Mrs. Thornfield, I should mention that Mr. Rodriguez's current installation appears to comply with all county regulations and state renewable energy guidelines. Margaret shot him a look that could have melted steel. Mr. Blackwood, I'm not paying you to side with the opposition. Ma'am, I'm not siding with anyone. I'm simply stating the legal reality of the situation. I stood up and dusted off my jeans. I appreciate you folks coming out here, but I'm not moving my turbine. It's legal, it's beneficial to the community, and it's staying put. Margaret's composure finally cracked. Mr. Rodriguez, you seem to think you hold all the cards here, but you're mistaken. We've researched your little power supply arrangement, and we have alternatives, such as Austin Energy has offered to extend municipal power lines to Millbrook Estates at a very reasonable cost. We don't need your wind farm. This was interesting. How reasonable. The connection fee would be approximately $2.3 million, with ongoing costs of about 0.11 per kilowatt hour. I did the math in my head. Austin Energy was offering to charge them 11 cents per kilowatt hour versus the 70 cents I could provide through my wind farm. Over the course of a year, that would cost Millbrook Estates an additional $400,000 in electrical costs. Mrs. Thornfield, if you want to pay Austin Energy an extra $400,000 per year for the privilege of avoiding my wind turbine, that's your business. But I should mention that Austin Energy gets about 30% of their power from wind farms anyway. You'd still be using wind power, just paying more for it. Richard was frantically taking notes. Mrs. Thornfield, we should discuss the financial implications of this decision with the HOA board before. The board will support whatever decision is necessary to maintain community standards, Margaret snapped. I picked up my work gloves and headed toward my truck. Well, folks, I've got cattle to feed. You know where to find me if you want to discuss a reasonable solution. As I drove away, I could see them in my rearview mirror, Margaret gesturing wildly while Richard looked like he was trying to talk her down from a ledge. That weekend, I received a call that changed everything. Miguel, it's Danny Kim. I've got some interesting news about your Millbrook Estate situation. What's up, Danny? Austin Energy got a formal request this week for a cost estimate on extending municipal power to that community. The preliminary numbers are substantial. How substantial? About $3.2 million for the initial infrastructure, plus ongoing costs that would make their residents scream. But that's not the interesting part. What's the interesting part? The request came through official channels, which means it's now part of the public record. It's also triggered an environmental impact assessment, since they'd have to clear about 12 acres of protected wetland to run the power lines. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair. Wetland? Yeah, there's a seasonal creek that runs between Millbrook Estates and the municipal grid. It's habitat for a couple of protected bird species. The environmental review process alone could take 18 months, assuming they can get approval at all. Margaret had just made a massive strategic error. By formally requesting municipal power connection, she'd created a public paper trail that I could use to demonstrate the environmental and economic benefits of my wind farm. More importantly, she'd given me leverage I didn't even know I needed. Monday morning, I drove to the Millbrook Estates Community Center with a folder of my own. Margaret was in her office, hunched over her computer like she was planning the invasion of Normandy. "Good morning, Mrs. Thornfield. I thought you might be interested in some information about Austin Energy's environmental review process." She looked up with barely concealed hostility. "What are you talking about?" I sat down across from her desk without being invited again and opened my folder. "I understand you've requested a formal cost estimate for municipal power connection. That's triggered some interesting regulatory requirements." Margaret's face went pale. "How do you know about that?" "Public records, ma'am. Austin Energy is required to file environmental impact assessments for all major infrastructure projects. The good news is they're very thorough. The bad news is they're very slow." I pulled out the first document, a map showing the proposed power line route. According to the preliminary survey, the connection would require clearing approximately 12.3 acres of protected wetland habitat. That's home to 2 species of migratory birds that are protected under the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Margaret grabbed the document and started reading frantically. "This can't be right." "Oh, it gets better. The environmental review process typically takes 14 to 24 months, depending on the complexity of the ecosystem impact. If any endangered species are involved, it could take even longer." I pulled out another document. The estimated cost has also been revised upward. Austin Energy now projects $3.7 million for initial infrastructure, plus 0.13 per kilowatt-hour for ongoing service. Margaret was doing rapid calculations on her computer. $3.7 million divided by 247 houses. That's almost $15,000 per household, just for the connection fee. Plus the increased electrical costs. By my calculation, switching to municipal power would cost each household about $2,800 per year more than your current arrangement. I leaned back in my chair and watched her process the numbers. Of course, there's an alternative, which is we expand our current renewable energy partnership. I'm prepared to install additional wind turbines and solar arrays that could reduce Millbrook Estates' electrical costs by another 20%. All I ask in return is that the HOA drop this architectural compliance dispute and work with me as a partner instead of treating me as an enemy." Margaret stared at the documents for a long moment. When she finally looked up, I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. "Mr. Rodriguez, even if what you're proposing makes financial sense, I have an obligation to the residents to maintain community standards. That wind turbine is still an eyesore." I pulled out my final document, a survey I'd commissioned over the weekend. I hired an independent surveying company to determine the actual visibility of my turbine from Millbrook Estates properties. Would you like to know what they found? I'm sure you're going to tell me. My turbine is clearly visible from exactly 23 houses out of 247. Of those 23 houses, 19 report that they can only see the top portion of the blades, and only when they're standing in specific locations on their property. Margaret was quiet now, so I continued. I also had them survey resident attitudes toward renewable energy. 73% of your neighbors support wind power in principle. 68% would be willing to accept visible wind turbines in exchange for lower electrical costs. You surveyed my residents without permission? I conducted a scientific poll of area residents regarding energy policy preferences. Completely legal and above board. I stood up and gathered my documents. "Mrs. Thornfield, you have a choice. You can continue fighting a legal battle you can't win, at a cost your residents can't afford, to solve a problem that most of them don't care about. Or you can work with me to build something better. What exactly are you proposing? A 5-year renewable energy partnership. I'll provide clean power at current rates, with guaranteed cost increases of no more than 2% annually. I'll also establish a $50,000 annual fund for community improvements, landscaping, park maintenance, whatever the residents vote for. Margaret's eyebrows shot up. $50,000 would go a long way toward making her look good to the HOA membership. And in exchange, you drop all architectural compliance actions against my current turbine. You support a variance request for 2 additional turbines on my property. And you stop treating me like a criminal for generating clean energy. I headed for the door, then turned back. Oh, and Mrs. Thornfield? Channel 8 called this morning. They're planning to run their story on Wednesday evening. I told them I'd be available for an interview about community cooperation on renewable energy projects. I left her sitting there with my proposal, surrounded by documents that proved she'd painted herself into a corner. Tuesday afternoon, Margaret called me. Mr. Rodriguez, the HOA board has reviewed your proposal. We're prepared to accept your terms with one modification, which is, we want oversight of the Community Improvement Fund. The HOA board should have input on how that money is spent. That's reasonable. 50-50 split on decision-making? Agreed. And the architectural compliance fines? Waived. Your existing turbine will be grandfathered under agricultural use provisions. What about the additional turbines? There was a long pause. The board will consider variance requests on a case-by